Okay, so it's almost 5 minutes past, so we are going to start. And let me introduce Dr. Neus Figueras, although I don't think she needs an introduction, but anyway, I will as a formal thing to do, but I think we all know who she is. She's been involved in a number of international research and development projects related to assessment at different education levels. And as we know, has given courses and presented in universities in several countries. She's also carried out consultancy work in assessment and in curriculum design, and collaborates regularly with the Council of Europe in the uses and dissemination of the CEFR. She's one of the authors of the Manual for Relating Examinations to the CEFR, and has recently co-edited with David Little, Reflecting on the CEFR and its Companion Volume, which was published in 2022. She has contributed to the publication of a language education with the CEFR, a handbook, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And this was jointly published by the British Council, UCALTA, IALTA, and ALTI, and it's publicly available online. She's also a founding member of IALTA, the European Association for Language Testing and Assessment, and is currently the coordinator of the IALTA CEFR SIG. She's also a founding member of CIELE, which is the interest group for assessment of languages in Spain. And without further ado, you have the floor.
Thank you, Julia. I'll share my screen and get started. Wait a minute. Yep. Oh. Sorry. I made a fool of myself now. Just a second. Wait a minute. Okay. Now. Okay. Can everybody see it okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction, Julia, and thank you, CERCleS, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk to colleagues and talk about what we do. And I'm going to be talking about the handbook, a document that we published in 2022, and which we know is being used by a number of institutions and individuals across Europe and beyond Europe. But we also think that the handbook has not yet shown its full potential, and that's why when I started preparing the session, I thought that I would talk about the handbook, of course, but you cannot talk about the handbook if you not refer clearly to the CFR, to the CFR Companion Volume, and to what language education in different languages, apart from the most widely taught ones like English or French or Spanish or Chinese, can use it for. So this is why I'm going to be talking about language education, and I'll give you 2 seconds as I tell you about the rest of the issues I'm going to be dealing with. Think of the key elements that I will include in language education. I'm going to talk about the CFR and the CFR alignment, about the handbook and the comprehensive learning system, about how to get started in using the handbook, and some summing up and some recommendations. So let's get started with language education, which I think we will all agree that takes in it the curriculum, the what, the delivery or the teaching and the learning, the how, and the how well, which is the assessment. So when we talk about language education, we talk about curriculum, we talk about teaching and learning, and we talk about assessment. And when we talk about curriculum, we need to go back to the 1940s, surprise, surprise, and to Ralph Tyler, who already in the 1940s said that a curriculum defines learning objectives, establishes useful learning experiences, how to teach, organizing learning experiences, how to teach again, and how to involve the learners. The learners are here, and how to evaluate it, and that's assessment, and then going back to whether the curriculum needs to be changed or slightly edited or amended or whatever. So that's so far for curriculum. If we look at the teaching and the learning, what goes on in the classroom with students and with teachers, we need to think of the different dimensions that come into play, the context, different levels of education, your experience in language centers, in universities may be very different from the experience of primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, private language schools, etc. Then there's the affective dimension, what the students bring with them to the classroom, the interactive dimension, how interactions are created, instructional dimension, how teacher delivers, the learning dimension, how students take it, how their abilities and how their learning is being elicited and how that is being assessed. So all these dimensions, which are actually part of the work that Jim Purpura and Carolyn Turner did when they were trying to define language learning-oriented assessment. And I have the feeling, well, not the feeling, I have the certainty that you were listening to Jim Purpura some time ago about his learning-oriented approach to assessment. He argued that all these dimensions came into play when you're trying to assess what your students are learning or have learned. And then we go back to assessment. And I like this quote. Dylan William, who's not a language teacher, who's a teacher of mathematics, very clearly explained why we assess. Because if the students learn what we teach, there's no need for assessment. What we don't know what students learn or whether students learn what we teach. So this needs to be taken into consideration, and that's why assessment is necessary. But then assessment is usually a bone of contention with teachers because, in fact, the assessment universe is almost as complex as the classroom universe. There's international contexts. Many of your students will be taking international exams, or some students in other contexts, maybe not in your contexts, will take national exams. Then there's also school exams or district or state exams. Then there's teacher and classroom, and you may use all sorts of types of assessment, formative, diagnostic, summative assessment for learning. That's up to you. And then there's how to engage students in their self-assessment and how to help them document and become aware of what they are learning. So the key here is to be able to make sure that we can link what the students learn with what external assessments tell us. And this goes back to the different dimensions that we need to take into consideration in learning-oriented assessment, no matter whether it is informal or formal, whether it's classroom assessment or whether it's any other type of assessment. In any case, we need to cope with the tensions that come from the need to be international, to be accountable internationally, and to be locally relevant, to reconcile what is global with what is local, what is common to many, but what is diverse, what is new as a methodology, and what has been working for a long time. Why should we not use what has been working for so long? How to make sure that external standards or our own standards match the objectives in the classroom, then trying to look at the vertical, how the levels develop from A to B to C, if we use the CFR terminology that everybody is mostly familiar with now, and whether we assign, what value we assign to these level labels. what descriptors we choose to illustrate what this level means. The difference between what politicians say, what rectors say, what deans say, and what we can do in our classrooms, and whether our approach comes from the top or comes from the bottom. How to reconcile our teaching with what the curriculum expects us to do or what we think the students will be able to do. So in this context, which is very much today's context, um, we could already see that there were things that needed to be done at the end of the last century. And this is why the CFR came to being. So in 1990, different ministries and different governments started talking about the need for a common policy to explain and to improve language education. And that's what made the CFR start to be developed and eventually be published. And the main features of the CFR in 2001, you may know, I'm sure you do, the action-oriented approach to foster transparency, comparability, and progress, and to improve how we teach and how we communicate what we teach and how can we compare what we teach, how do we compare a student leaving a Spanish university after 3 years of study in a language center to a student leaving a German university after a 3 year study? How can that be compared beyond how many hours, who was the teacher, what book they used, etc.? The CFR was planned to help language learning, the planning of language learning programs, certifications, and learner self-directed learning, and also the famous labels and all the descriptors illustrating those labels. And the descriptors in the CFR always talk about what a person can do in the language, how well this can be done, and under which circumstances. If you look at the descriptors in the CFR and you think of what they say, they normally, in all cases, they say what you can do in a language, how well you can do it, and under which circumstances, the limitations. But the CFR was widely accepted by everybody, but mostly in terms of level labels. It was also highly criticized, but the bottom line, and this is what fostered further work about, around, and on the CFR, was the rather weak implementation in the language classrooms. A lot of teachers and students and policymakers said that the CFR was used, yes, but the levels were espoused rather than real. People talked about the level labels, but did not perhaps use the action-oriented approach. They talked about the macro, but not the micro, the details, the concepts behind the CFR, and they focused on certain activities. I will try and avoid using the term skills because the term skills, I suppose that you've noticed, does not appear in the CFR and does not appear in the companion volume. They rather talk about language activities. So after 25 years of the publication of the CFR, we, the profession, still talk about skills. And projects that are being organized these days still find it very difficult to talk about communication activities or language activities and would prefer to stick to the term skill: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So because we in general were certain that the CFR could be put to better use, the Council of Europe, following comments from many people, decided to expand, revise, and find ways of making sure that the CFR would be put to a better use. And that's why in 2017, a new edition of the CFR was published, a provisional version that saw the light in 2020 in the end. It was an improvement. There were more descriptors by level, a wider spectrum was described, there was increased clarity of presentation, there were plurilingual scales, very useful in bilingual and CLIL programs, vocational purposes, and yet again, the companion volume insisted on ways to go beyond the 4 skills. That's the only time I'm going to use the term, the 4 skills. And they discovered that in one of the first editions of the CFR in 1996, there was this nice diagram that showed how communication worked. There was production, and then there was reception, and there was interaction. And if interaction was not possible between production and reception, then mediation was needed. So they insisted on the new companion volume on the development of additional descriptors for mediation, an activity that had been described in 2001 but had no descriptors, and now there are descriptors. The problems. So the companion volume has also had some criticisms. There's an increased number of scales and descriptors. We'll talk about that later. There's specific training needed to implement the new scales. That's why 5 years after the publication, we still have a webinar that talks about this. Different countries and different contexts may have different perceptions of scales like the plurilingual ones or scales like the mediation ones. And we had the feeling that there were not enough recommendations on how to go about aligning any resource to the CFR. So the new scales, just for in case some of you cannot remember which ones they are, there's some additional scales to the ordinary ones. There's the new scales on mediation. There's the new scales on plurilingual and pluricultural competence. So we have a total of 35 new scales, 24 are for mediation, plus the supplementary descriptors in Appendix 9, which needs to be added to the 54 scales in the 2001 CFR, which justifies why a group of people like me and other colleagues decided that something had to be done with this. We have now a descriptive scheme that is really fully comprehensive and includes scales and descriptors for all competences, activities, and strategies that you have in this overall descriptive scheme. And we have the novelty of the considerable amount of mediation activities, plus the plurilingual and the pluricultural. So after I've been talking for something like 15 minutes, 20 minutes almost, and I'd like to stop for 1 second and ask you about your reactions to the CFR Companion Volume, whether you felt enthusiastic, cautious, indifferent, or you worried about it. Do you want to share your thoughts in the chat briefly? Just write one of these terms. You may write another one, but it may be nicer if we all stick to this. Let's have a look at. Don't think too much. Enthusiastic, that's good, CercleS, of course. Enthusiasm, good. That sounds to me more realistic. Cautious, yeah. So no indifference. That's interesting. And a bit worried, Carmen. Yeah, very realistic. Okay. So I'll ask you another question, and I'm not going to ask you to respond to that, but to think about it. The CFR and the CFR Companion Volume in 2001 and 2020, they insist on the need to have transparency and coherence between curriculum, teaching, and assessment within an institution and transparency and coherence between institutions, educational sectors, regions, and countries. I gather that this is what CercleS is trying to do, trying to achieve transparency and coherence between language centers in your universities in different regions and countries. So 10 points for you. And my question for you as individuals and as members of a department in any university is to think, how happy are you with how transparent and coherent is the relationship between your curriculum, your teaching, and your assessment? Think about this. And this is what justified us to start work on doing something that would help to this unity of curriculum, teaching, and assessment. Because what we focused on when we started thinking about this transparency and coherence was that, in fact, the companion volume insists on the importance of context, localization, selecting from day one, chapter one, first few pages, it says select, pick and choose. Don't try to bite everything because you have an indigestion. But we teachers want to have everything. So we try to, approach the companion volume as a whole. And we need to do the exercise of selecting what is relevant for our context and adapting it. And they give us graphs that show how different activities may be more important in, for example, in lower secondary CLIL programs than in others. And the most important thing is that the main function of descriptors is to help align curriculum, teaching, and assessment. Educators can select descriptors according to their relevance to the particular context, adapting them if necessary. And this takes me to two questions. The first one is the why. Why should we be doing this? But the second one is how. So I'll address the why first, and then I'll go to the how. Why align? Why should this be aligned? We talked about alignment already. We didn't mention the term alignment. We talked about linking, and you must be familiar about the manual for linking exams to the CFR, the famous and infamous, is my B1 like your B1? Where, we more and more we talk about what's your B1 like. Is your B1 like my B1? In what aspects would you focus in your B1 are the same as my B1? That type of question has been going around for quite a number of years now. So this is what we had in the relating examinations to the CFR, the linking process. You specify what your exam is like. First of all, you familiarize yourselves with the CFR, you specify, you do standard setting, and you do validation. You all have heard that, especially if you're involved in any of the CEFR or CercleS exams. But this is why we developed the handbook, because we thought that if we did not talk about curriculum and delivery, people would start thinking that the CFR is mostly useful for assessment and not for teaching, not for writing curricula, or not for approaching our classes. So a number of institutions that Julia has already mentioned contributed to this. The document is fully available. It's already available in Spanish. It's being translated into a number of languages, and you will hear about that. So basically, the CFR Aligning Language Education Handbook has to do with trying to improve language education and trying to integrate curriculum, delivery, and assessment, the three key elements in language education. And I'll give you an example for you to have a graphical idea. Most of you drive, I'm sure. And when you go to the mechanic, if you have a wheel puncture, the mechanic will probably tell you that your wheels have not been well aligned, or you have a problem with your wheels. because wheel alignment is key. It is very important in a vehicle. If the wheels are not well aligned, the vehicle has all sorts of problems. So the same happens with language education. If curriculum, assessment, and delivery are not aligned, there's trouble. Trouble because, oh, this exam doesn't reflect what I'm doing. Well, is this the fault of the exam, or is this the fault of what you're doing? Or is this the fault of the curriculum? They should bring together the three elements in a coherent whole. I'm going to go quickly with this. What we understand by curriculum, what we understand by delivery, not only teachers, what they do in the classroom, but materials and also the physical space. Delivery, think of the complex description of Turner and Purpura that I showed to you before. And assessment, think of any type of assessment that you may do, either very informal, looking at a student and just intimating that he or she could do better, or giving those students a test. So all these elements need to be linked, because if they are not linked, there's a number of challenges, or rather problems. If there's a new curriculum, but teachers have no training, there's a problem. If the assessment does not fit the curriculum, then there's another problem. If the textbooks do not reflect the curriculum, that is, the textbooks do not follow a communicative approach, or vice versa, then you have a problem. And the curriculum, the teacher training, and the assessment are well aligned, but the way the classroom is structured, or the way your students are working, or the background of your students does not match what you've planned, then you have a problem. So what's the handbook about? The handbook is about users, context, needs, and available resources. It is much thinner than the CFR Companion Volume, much thinner than the CFR. We put it together thinking of different users in different contexts, with different needs and with different resources. We were careful that it should have impact, meaning positive impact and considered useful. We know that it's been considered useful and practical, but still we need to work harder on that. Brief, simple, and exemplification. We're getting there. We're not there yet, but we'll soon be there with examples. And the different chapters coincide with the chapters of the manual for relating examination to the CFR. You cannot relate anything to the CFR if you do not know what the CFR is. And if you have to relate something to the CFR, you have to be able to describe it. You have to be able to describe your what. If you cannot describe your what and your how, then you cannot standardize anything. So, and then of course, then you have to show how good you are, and that's why you've done this exercise. The why: achieving systemic coherence and transparency, establishing a basis from principled comparison and monitoring for purposes of quality assurance. Rings a bell, takes us back to the CFR, and highlights the context. Localization, it is key. Question: why? Sorry, what happened? I don't know. Let's do it again.
Posted.
Sorry. Let's do it again. So how do we do that? There's two possible processes. You may have a course that you want to align to the CFR, or you may have to design a course, a new resource, to align to the CFR. So the two processes can be used in using the handbook. Then you may be a type of audience that needs to go deeper into the CFR. You may be a teacher, a syllabus designer, a test producer, a textbook writer, or you may only have to have a general idea. You may be the dean, and the dean may need to learn something about the CFR as well. So these two audiences are also possible, and this is why we have different approaches in the handbook. And what the importance is, what does each voice require from the process, and what challenges? There's different challenges for administrators or for teachers. The key stages, you know that: familiarization, specification, standardization, you know that. And these stages can be collated into 4 main stages: familiarization, getting to know things; specifications, analyzing where you are and what you have; decision making, the detailed process of aligning a syllabus or assessment to the descriptors; and then quality assurance, the validation. Yeah, doing fine. Then we also have in the handbook notes for your implementation. We started calling this section health warnings. Health warnings. You are the best judge of what is and is not possible or realistic in your context of operation. We teachers try to do too much, and then reality strikes. So we ask at the end of each chapter some questions like this, and recommendations. And then there's linking forms that help you adapt and adopt your approach. So this is the overall process of that we describe in the handbook, and this process needs to be tackled in one way or another by you if you want to claim that whatever you do is aligned to the CFR. So I'm going to go step by step now in how you could proceed. First of all, if you want to get started, you need to ask a number of questions. Why? Why is are we, us, our in red? Because this can be plural, but it can be singular. When we started work on the handbook, we were fully aware of the huge amount of people who were working on their own. There's a lot of freelancers in our profession. There's a lot of people who cannot afford to go to seminars, who cannot pay for it, who have no time for it. So why am I doing this? Which steps are essential for me in my context, for my purpose? So these questions you can ask yourself as an individual, or if you're working in a group, you may want to talk about the plural. And then there's another question that is the umbrella to these questions. Who do I need to convince to get on board? Who do I need to convince to make sure that the project can get started? Your boss, your colleagues, etc. So we're back to the 4 stages, and we start with familiarization. Remember, we talked about different types of stakeholders: those who need to go deep into the CFR, those who may not have to go deep. So that's why we've planned generic and specific familiarization, which allow you to make sure that you're familiar with the purpose and approach, but you also focus on the scales that are relevant to your context in your curriculum. I've added this transparency from a colleague from Vula Canistra, who talks about the huge importance of familiarization. You have all been through sessions on familiarization. I know that you've been doing the sorting exercises, you've been doing puzzles, etc. But familiarization I liked the way that Vula described it as the Ouroboros of the alignment circle. Ouroboros is a Greek term. She's Greek, so she always, whenever it's possible, she talks about Greece. Ouroboros means that familiarization is ongoing. You never know enough about the CFR. You have to familiarize yourself generically with everything, but then specifically with all the aspects that you need as you make progress. So, training needs to go on. Yeah, it's a critical competency. You need to be consistently familiar. You need to be validly familiar, and this has to be sustainable across a long time. You can start individually. You can start as a group and follow the suggestions in Handbook and document it. Write down what you do. Specifications. Again, you may be generic, an overall linking of the structure, or a specific fine-grained level. It depends on how much time you have, how many resources you have, and how important the process is in your context and what impact will it have. In this case, you may have to, again, when we talk about top down and bottom up, you may have to think of the needs analysis if you're creating a new resource, or you may have to start identifying your objectives, what you have, before you go to identifying the CFR, whether what you have is related to the CFR or not, and then finish your mapping. So we could have a look at this. You have, imagine this is a bottom-up approach. You have your course. You have a level. So if you have B1, you don't have to worry about familiarizing yourself with the C2. Yeah. So you have a B1 course, imagine, with your objectives. And once you've got these described, you go to the CFR, the contents and the levels, and you ask yourself, where are the matches? Are they matching or not? Then you look at your activities. Second time I'm going to be using skills. Which skills have you described? Go to the CFR and look at the scales. Which scales are you tapping on in your curriculum, in your objectives, in your classroom? And then, which descriptors in those scales are relevant for you? Do they have to be adapted because the CFR does not cover what you wanted to cover? Or do you have to adapt your objectives because you think that the CFR has a better description than yours? So once you've done this, then you document and you report. It looks like, straightforward. It is straightforward, but it's, time consuming. I'll show you an example that was done by colleagues who were trying to write up a curriculum for B1 speaking in general, meaning production, oral interaction, and mediation, spoken mediation, right? The three had to be collated into the overall speaking. And this is the link that I've written in the chat. And maybe there's no time for you to download it, but if you click on that link, you will find that there's a searchable tool in the CFR pages, and you will find this list under descriptors, and you click on CFR descriptors searchable, and you will download an Excel file translated into English, Italian, Spanish, French, and I can't remember another one. And you can filter different levels, different scales, different language activities, different descriptors, etc. And this is what you need to use whenever you need to specify what you want to do with your resource. This is an example of what this project did. They looked at this descriptor in oral production. From the oral production scale, they selected it, they decided to keep as it was, and they said, why? Justifications. It's broad, but could be used for overall descriptors. Then, if we look at the descriptor number 3, and they numbered them so that they could refer to them easily and track their progress, can reasonably fluently relate a straightforward narrative or description as a sequence of points? No. Why? Because it was already included in speaking to. There's something that you find out when you start using this, and that is the huge amount of duplicity that you can find in the CFR. And this is not a defect. This is something that it may increase your time, but nobody can choose for you. You are the one who has to choose, and you are the one who has to decide, I want this, I want that, I want to collate these two, and I don't want to use this one because it's already there. So don't be afraid of saying, this is not useful for me because of this and that and the other. Yeah. So after all this sort of sifting, they transformed this sort of rather long, and they only focused on B1. Yeah. So that's why it's important to use the searchable tool. If you only focus on B1, you get more than 100 descriptors. And they couldn't have 100 descriptors. That's what they ended up with. This was the draft of what they wanted to tap in their assessment of B1 speaking for young adults. Overall production and interaction, can you see? They collated production and interaction, and then 2 descriptors for sustained monologue, 1 for understanding an interlocutor, 1 for conversation, 1 for information exchange, and 1 for mediation, relaying specific information in speech or sign. Yeah? So that's what specification is about, specifying what you're doing. In fact, you may do this, and then you can draft your own descriptors as they did, or you may compare your selection without adaptation to your already existing descriptors. So it's either one or the other, but this is the way to proceed. Yeah. So these 2 steps, you can stop here if you want to, because you know what you're doing, you familiarize yourself with the CFR, and then you know how to go about comparing and contrasting what you do with what the CFR says. But then there's another step, and here comes, I'll skip this one. Here comes the need for standardization, standard setting if you're working with assessment, specifically with exams, and validation. You may want to skip the orange and the light blue and focus only on the validation of what you have reached, but you may want to discuss as well, some with colleagues or with outsiders, whether what you're doing is perceived as something that is rightly done. I am not going to focus on standard setting because we are not talking about exams only. So make sure that you have some sort of external vetting that guarantees standardization, which you will be able to use when you come to validation, which is presenting the evidence that you've got an alignment claim. Just briefly, I'll distinguish briefly between standardization and standard setting. The subtitle for standardization is, does the resource accurately reflect the CFR level it targets? Whereas standard setting, you set a level. How good is good enough in that performance? Yep, I'm not going to, I think I would like to finish on time. So I don't think that we need to go deeper into standardization, where you will need to have a coordinate. When you get to standardization, then you cannot fly solo anymore. You can be solo in familiarization and in specification. When you get to standardization, you need somebody else to check what you've done. So you will need a coordinator. You'll need to select participants. You need a certain amount of work to be completed. And remember, it's time consuming. So check if you want to do it, or you may decide to stop at the end of specification and leave standardization for the next term or for the next year. The same with standard setting. And then ask yourselves whether it's relevant or not. And these challenges, you will have the PowerPoint. So these challenges in standardization, these challenges in standard setting, because it's going beyond your decisions into comparing what you've done with what others have done. And what others have done is not always available, because people don't like showing what they've done, because they not always document it properly, and they don't want to show. In any case, in the handbook, we have advice on how to proceed for standardization or standard setting. So we're back to validation. This looks very complicated, but you have on the left, you have the specification, standardization, standard setting, validation, and then you have evidence. And here come the forms that I referred to at the beginning when I was describing the handbook. If you keep writing down in those forms what you're doing, then it's a question of putting these forms together and writing up some text. It depends on whether this needs to go to the head of department, it needs to be safely filed in your department, or it needs to go as a report to the rector. The degree of rigid argumentation will vary depending on the destinatory of your documentation, because you will have collected evidence on these different steps. These are the questions to address. Check the documentation, check the line of argument, and develop a quality assurance process. Because it's not enough to say, I'm aligned, bye-bye. No, you need to make sure that this alignment is sustainable over time. This is the broad structure of the report. Say why you did it, in what ways you did it, how you can prove what you did, write it up, say what you're claiming, and try to make sure that everybody knows that you've done a good job. This is in the handbook as well, page 70. You can have a look at this. And I'll give you a concrete example in 2 minutes. Yes. Imagine that you work in a language center and the head of studies has asked you to design a B2 speaking course. You're familiar with the levels, but you have not used the document recently. You've learned about the publication, but not very much. And the course will start in a month, and you cannot join any group training. So this is normally quite common. Do it, as we say in Spanish, do it by yesterday. So where do you start? Generic familiarization, specification and standardization, and validation, the 3 steps. So we give advice. This comes straight from the handbook. You do generic familiarization, then you identify the most relevant scales for your course as activity 4, overall oral production, overall oral interaction, using that searchable tool, and then keep track of what you've done and complete summary from form 1. Specification, collate, select, and draft. You collate the descriptors for B2 in the scales that you selected in activity 4 and identify the keywords, select the relevant descriptors, draft your objectives, and comes the beginning of standardization. Compare your draft with other courses publicly available, other courses from other universities, other courses from other language schools, etc., and check with colleagues if possible, and then try to revise your draft. And finally, validation. You write a summary of what you did, the form you completed in 1, the rationale for your selection, the course description, and some suggestions for methodology, CFR-informed teaching and assessment activities. So all this sort of long story boils down to these 3 elements. But first of all, you need to start with familiarization. Summing up, Always, always remember the lessons that you learned from the implementation or the uses of the CFR. Most probably you tried to do too much. You tried to only use it in assessment. And you said that you were focusing on the CFR, but basically you were focusing on the level labels. And instead of talking about intermediate, you talked about B1. And then you had long arguments whether intermediate was B1 or B2. And that's something that textbook writers have not helped with. But anyway, so make sure that you distinguish between what is claimed and what is real. Remember that alignment is multidimensional. So curriculum, delivery, assessment, and it's development. It's ongoing. It's ongoing. It has to be localized. You need to, there's no way of escaping reading what you are going to do. Read, select, plan, act, document, disseminate, monitor, and document. So it's a circle. It's an Ouroboros, as Vula would say. Of course, use digital resources and artificial intelligence as you can. This in Spanish, for example, a colleague from the University of Murcia has put together a much more user-friendly, searchable tool, but it's only available in Spanish. So have a look at the one you have in English or in Italian that I think can be useful. Take JEDI, justice, equity, not equality, equity, diversity and inclusion, and place the learner at the center. Always think of the learners and involve as many people as you can. And try to introduce a relationship, which is always a tension between bottom up and top down. And then you're done. This is if you're a group leader, you create a decision group, you allocate time and budget, you build a schedule. This is all written down in the handbook. If you're a group leader, you get some advice for that as well. And I think that you're done. Just to finish, remember that if you are able to get as far as here, you'll be the master of the universe with the CFR. But also remember that you're never going to be the master of the universe. You always have to stay tuned. In fact, we're producing a supplement to the handbook. Don't wait for the supplement. Start using the handbook, but there's going to be a brief supplement incorporating what colleagues have said that they would prefer the handbook to do, and we've added that into a short supplement that's going to be no longer than 20 pages, and it's going to be available by the end of the year. And also in January, there's going to be available a special issue of the CFR journal, free of access. I'm going to send the CercleS Secretariat the links for these documents as soon as they appear so that you can be in the loop. And that's it. And here's some references if you want to work harder and read more. And if there's some, well, I'm almost there. 3 minutes left, but I can stay on for 5 more minutes if there's any questions. And this is it. All done. Up to you.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. And if you can stay for 5 more minutes,
Yeah. No, no
the floor
problem.
is open for questions. So does anybody have a question? Either write it down in the chat or just ask to speak.
And the link, Monse, the link was at the very beginning.
I resent it. I
yeah.
resent it. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Does anybody have any questions or comments? Because I have one, if nobody.
Okay.
How much adapting is too much? Because when you're talking about resources and practicality, sometimes you find yourself that you find that you want to do everything, but you cannot. So how much adapting is too much for you to be
You
not?
always need to think of the less is more. I
Okay.
mean, the CFR is not the Bible. The CFR is not perfect. but you are not perfect either. And my experience tells me that more and more I still see many marking schemes that start focusing on mistakes, on the negative, as if the CFR had not insisted on the fact that all the descriptors show what you can do, not what you cannot do, how well you can do that, and under which conditions and limitations. I didn't stress that enough. But the revolution in the CFR was that you describe what the students can do. You do not focus on they cannot do, because at levels A1 or A2, they can. If you want to describe what they cannot do, you'll never finish. There's so much they cannot do, and then you always have to feel that the descriptors are recognizably using the terminology of the CFR. Belen, I don't know if she's still with us. Belen in Jaén has put together a very interesting project, an international project that is helping them um, expand the descriptors um, for students of Spanish, students of English, Spanish students of English. And on the basis of corpora, language corpora, they decided on supplementing the descriptors. So they keep the descriptor as it is, but they supplement it with information on what students can do in terms of language. Because as the CFR is only international, it doesn't focus on what a student, on what the language of a student at B2 looks like if the student is English or German or Spanish. And more and more, there's a number of projects that actually try to help define better the descriptors. But there's always remember the hypertextual approach. The descriptor is 2 lines, and we teachers tend to, complement it, and we overdo it. It depends on what we want to do, always.
There's another question in the chat
Yeah.
that says, what does the CFR have for intercultural communication as a skill?
There's a lot in the plurilingual scales, and in mediation of concepts, it is there as well. Um, but you need to, again, in that case, if you're interested in that, you need to focus, you need to go to the searchable tool and focus on those descriptors. If you have a printout, then you may go directly to the new scales and check them in print. But I mean, there's quite a lot in terms of intercultural in the CFR, but it's not always explicit. And in fact, you need to ask yourself how relevant in your context it is to focus on the intercultural. And when are you going to start? Are you going to start in A1, which I think you should? I remember when I was, teaching, my students told me, my first year students told me, since I started learning English, I've become more polite. I use please, excuse me, and thank you twice as much as I used to in Spanish. So, is this intercultural? Is this plurilingual? Is this, what is this? So, I mean, you have to explore. Think of what you're interested in, think of what you need, and explore what you can find in the CFR.
Thank you. Thank you very much again for accepting
Okay.
our invitation. And I think this is very useful information for
I
all
hope
of
so.
us.
Get started.
And we need to get started. Exactly. The next step is to get started. So thank you very much for being with
Okay.
us.
Take care.
Bye bye. Bye
Bye
bye,
bye. Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you
Bye.
for
Thank
being
you for your
here with us.
attention.